You think you know Scotland. You think you know what made us. This video will open your eyes and answer the question, why did Scotland resist English subjugation? And by the end, you'll understand why Scotland wasn't made in the Highlands, but in York. If you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then click the subscribe button at the bottom right of the screen. And if you enjoy this video, then give it a thumbs up, share it, and watch the next one. In the meantime, let me tell you a story. I'm Bruce Fummey, and I've been returning to my granny's hometown to make a series of videos about how Scotland was made in York. This is the last, possibly the most surprising, and probably the most important. But you'll have to judge that for yourself at the end. I've sometimes been accused of being anti-English. Yeah, like I hate my granny. Or Matt, my right-hand man and videographer back home, an Englishman from Peterborough. The tough-sounding twat. Drum's Cupcakery seems like a nice place to view York Minster. They weren't open in August 1175 when King William of Scotland walked in there, not as sovereign equal to the waiting English King Henry II, but as a vassal. He'd come down from Scotland, and with him all the bishops and earls and barons and knights and freeholders of his land, from the greatest even to the least. He came to do something that no Scottish king had done before. In that grand and hallowed place, William the Lion stepped forward and knelt in front of Henry II, performing public homage and swearing fealty on the Gospels for his entire kingdom of Scotland and for Galloway. He repeated that homage to Henry's son and heir to the English throne. Then, William's younger brother, David of Huntingdon, had to do the same. After the king's personal submission, he commanded his churchmen to do likewise. One by one, the bishops and all the abbots swore fealty to Henry II and his son, including an oath that if William broke the agreement with Henry, they would pass an interdict on Scotland until he complied. This pernicious pledge made the Scottish Church enforcers of Henry's overlordship. Next, the secular nobility of Scotland took their turn to perform their homage. William ceremonially sealed a charter to confirm his homage. Then finally, before the gathered assembly, Henry II had the terms of the Treaty of Falaise read aloud. What happened in there in August 1175 was unprecedented. The King of Scots and all his nobles had done homage in an English cathedral, acknowledging the English as their overlord. Now, if you want to know what led up to this, I made a video about it, and I'll put that and other relevant videos in the playlist at the end. What's far more important is what this treaty committed the Scots to do. William's humiliating ritual submission wasn't just for the lands held in England, but for the Kingdom of Scotland itself. His nobles now owed direct submission to Henry. So if William ever broke the treaty, Scottish nobility and the church were required to side with the King of England. What's more, the bishops were to place Scotland's church under English control. And we're not finished. William had to get permission from Henry for military action to put down rebellions in Scotland. A humiliating request that William was going to have to make almost immediately. William's brother and heir, David, and everyone else had to swear fealty to Henry's son and heir to make sure that everybody understood that feudal overlords weren't just for Christmas. They weren't even for life. It was for future generations. Add to that, castles in Edinburgh, Roxburgh, Berwick, Stirling and Jedburgh were to be garrisoned by English troops, paid for by the Scots, and you'll see why many Scots see this as the lowest point in our kingdom's story. And yet, in the long run, that humiliation here in York may have created the Scotland that you know. So, I said that William would have to ask Henry's permission to put down rebellion. Well, Gilbert of Galloway rose up in rebellion and murdered his own pro-English brother Uchtdrich in the process. Was this just private rivalry with his brother? Or was it a reaction by Gilbert in semi-autonomous Galloway to William giving away Galloway's freedoms to England? You see, there was also an uprising in Murray. This might be a good time to think about what Scotland was at the time. Just like William being a vassal to the English king didn't make Scots English, or Scotland part of England for that matter, Galloway and Murray were part of William's kingdom, but that didn't make them Scottish. What people called Scotland was from the River Forth to the River Spey, and as far west as the spine of mountains that separates that region from Argyll. When there were legal disputes about goods and ownership, people from Lothian, Galloway and Argyll had to meet to resolve them on the River Forth at Stirling Bridge, the border of what was then considered Scotland. William's kingdom was a patchwork of peoples: Scots in Scotland, English in Lothian, Welsh in Strathclyde, Gallividians to the southwest, Moravians in the north, and Argyll Scots to the west. So Argyll, from where the Scots had come, wasn't actually part of Scotland, even though they were subject to William, King of Scots. A little surprised that when William seemed weakened by his own submission to Henry, Galloway and Murray felt able to tell him where to stick it. Just before I tell you what happened next, let me remind you of what's happening in April 2027. I'm telling these stories of how Scotland was born in the places where things happen. I'll bring you here to Scone, but I'll also take you to our first spiritual home at Iona, where these kings were buried. I'll take you to Dunkeld, the first spiritual home of the unified kingdom, to St Andrews, where that centre moved to. I'll tell you the tales, we'll visit the places, you'll meet fantastic people and enjoy great hotels. I can't wait. I planned this tour specifically for you. Click the link top right or in the description below for details, or email alexis@scotlandhistorytours.co.uk. So, I've just said that some legal disputes would be dealt with on the border at Stirling Bridge. But there's another legal issue that shows the difference between Scotland and the other parts of William's kingdom. And by the way, don't imagine that I came up with all this brainy stuff myself. What I'm about to tell you is from a Rees Memorial lecture by Professor Bannockburn that blew my mind. Okay, so when property was transferred, there was often a bit of the legal document saying that the land or property was to be held freely and peacefully. I think that means that you didn't nick it or kill anyone to get it. But to freely and peacefully, they sometimes added the phrase, as it is in other parts of Scotland. It clarifies how and under whose law you hold the thing. I'm going to pass you this rugby ball to hold, just like all rugby balls are held in Scotland. Try not to drop it. We don't want you holding it like they hold them in England. If that seems a bit technical, the point is that Bannockburn went back and checked all these old documents to see how many land transfers had this clause about being held as other land in this place that we call Scotland. Today, we have all the baggage of our current day assumptions, politics and upbringings. It's difficult to understand what sense of belonging folks had 900 years ago. But one pointer to Scotland's legal and geographical reach and how many people saw themselves as Scottish is how often people tell us by using that little phrase during land transfers. Now, it so happens that the number of times we see the phrase and see it outside that core Scotland I described rockets at just the time that Henry II imposed the Treaty of Falaise, signed in that building. So during Henry II's overlordship of Scotland, land transfers all over the Kingdom of Scotland started to express a sense of belonging to a greater Scotland. Now, let's be clear, these land transfers weren't being made by the local sheep herder or dung shoveler. What it shows us is what's on the minds of the people transferring the land, like the church and the nobility. What? You mean the folks that were made to swear subservience to Henry II in York Minster? Aye, exactly. These folks belonged to the same Scoto-Norman elite as the Anglo-Norman elite that held lands in England. Sometimes because they were relatives, often because it was the same person who had lands in both kingdoms. Like the Bruces, brought north to Scotland from Yorkshire by William's granddad David I. Now in England, Henry had been making legal and administrative reforms that consolidated power to the crown. For example, in England, Henry was making his own judicial court more accessible to all, which meant that people could bypass the Barons' Court, reducing the influence of barons and strengthening cultural royal authority. Ho, 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 ho. The barons didn't like that. Whereas in Scotland, baronial power became more secure. So if you were a landholding noble with estates in both Scotland and England, you wouldn't want to see creeping anglicisation of the Scottish legal system. And all that subservient oath swearing here at York threatened exactly that. This French-speaking Norman elite may be culturally similar both sides of the border, but now one side wanted to make it clear that that border existed. And it was very shortly after that the treaty agreeing the border was signed in that building. One of the other videos in this York series covers that, and there'll be a link at the end. So the main driver bringing the various parts of the Scottish kingdom together as a single country may not have been Norman nobility feeling more Scottish, but wanting to make it clear that they weren't English. Henry's subjugation of Scotland and tightening grip in England brought some unintended consequences. The subjects of the King of Scots were changing. They were becoming Scottish. Scottish bishops sought to deal directly with Rome. Nobility failed to pay taxes to help Henry fund his crusades. And those property transfer documents made it clear that land was to be held as it was elsewhere in Scotland. A common cause grew not because the king told them they were Scottish, but because they wanted to live in a kingdom with institutions that weren't English. That helped crystallise their sense of identity. So the anyone but England thing you thought started with petty football rivalries of the 20th century actually started with late 12th century Norman nobility. And by the time Henry died in 1189, it was becoming a thing. The new English king, Richard the Lion, wanted to go on crusade, but he was strapped for cash. Suddenly, the Scoto-Norman nobility that had been unwilling to give cash to his dad for crusade came up with a cunning plan. You release us from that Treaty of Falaise and we'll give you a big bag of cash. Richard went for it. And it didn't take long for the Scottish barons to cough up the cash. Now think about that. They could have ticked along as things were with Richard as their overlord in the French, Norman feudal structures that they were all familiar with. but they were motivated enough to put their hands deep into their pockets at short notice to come up with 10,000 merks for Richard's crusade, just so that Scotland could be freed from subjugation to the English. Richard the Lion was bought and sold for Scottish gold. In 1189, when the Quick Claim of Canterbury officially ended Scotland's vassalage, it was a political victory. But a deeper shift had already started. The definition of Scotland as not England had taken root. And it began not with a declaration of independence, but with bended knee on the stone floor of York Minster. Changes here in York and England generally meant landholding Scoto-Norman nobles were motivated to pay cash for, to document property in, and to give allegiance to the kingdom of the Scots. Of course, the unification of Scotland doesn't happen overnight, but over time. In the summer of 1214, William the Lion headed north to deal with rebels and meet the Earl of Caithness. But it was obvious that he wasn't well. What's interesting is that one description of his journey back to Stirling, it says he returned from Murray to Scotland, and then from Scotland he proceeded into Lothian. Isn't that interesting? Murray and Lothian were still seen as separate entities to Scotland. When William died, Scotland still wasn't yet a unified whole. But change accelerated during the reign of his son, Alexander II. A really good indicator is the Chronicle of Melrose. Melrose, remember, was in that Anglo-Saxon region south of the Forth, subsumed by William's great-granddad, English-speaking rather than Gaelic. They'd seen the Scots as very different from themselves. Just like the men of Galloway, the Scots were wild and behaved beyond the limits of Christian decency. But about 4 years after Alexander II died, the chronicles describe events in Berwickshire as happening in southern Scotland. And something in Galloway the same year was in western Scotland. Now you could still see a distinction between north and south in the Forth a few years later. A 1222 entry in the Chronicle talked about a journey from Edinburgh as far as Aberdeen as going into Profunda Scotia, deep Scotland. By the time Alexander III died, even the monks at Melrose were describing themselves as Scots. And in the Hebrides had come under the Scottish crown. The distinction now was between Highland and Lowland Scots. But they were all Scots. So you see, the answer to Matt's question about Scottish distinctiveness might be based on a ceremony at York that was supposed to end Scottish sovereignty, but instead became the catalyst for a national awakening. Submission brought reflection and a determination to be separate. England's dominance highlighted Scotland's difference. Civic life, sheriff courts and royal boroughs built a shared experience. And somewhere in the background, beneath banners and beyond chronicles, our people began to imagine themselves as a nation. Nowadays, there's an assumption that the landholding class are those who prefer union. And the man in the street is the one that's more likely to support Scottish independence. But it started the other way around. And that journey started here in 1175 and took a century to complete. So when Alexander III died on that fateful ride home from Edinburgh to Kinghorn, Scotland was literally a different place. When Edward Longshanks tried to enforce submission and justify it with a treaty signed here, he found a very different prospect to the one faced by Henry II. Don't get me wrong, There was still internal division, feudal loyalties and clan rivalries, but William Wallace and Robert the Bruce took the nation on those final steps along the road that started here in York. Make no mistake, when Robert the Bruce raised his banner at Bannockburn, he was fighting for a personal crown. But the men who fought by his side were fighting for an identity that had been taking shape since the day Scotland bowed the knee in York Minster. The road to Bannockburn started here. It's just one of the ways that Scotland was made in York. Now, I've made other videos in the series, so please watch them. I've also made a playlist of videos with background and context that lead to this one, like what led up to the Treaty of Falaise and beyond. That playlist is coming up on screen now. Support the channel by clicking top right to become a Patreon member or buy me a coffee in the description below. In the meantime, Hammy and Doch is going to be Lamali. Sherry and Rasta.